Welcome to Faith and Science. I'm Dr. John Ashton. Often I hear people talking about, and I get the impression that many people today, particularly academics and educated people, feel that the Bible is out of date. And perhaps maybe they've been, taught in some of their studies somewhere that, the Bible is just the tradition of some Hebrews that, wrote down stuff according to their particular time in history, and that really the Bible isn't a special book in any way. Whereas, of course, the Bible itself, in many instances, talks about how the Bible was inspired by God, our Creator. Other times I've been in conversations where people will say, well, the Bible isn't really scientific either. It's not a scientific textbook. Well, it certainly is a scientific textbook. But if the Bible is inspired by God and is therefore true, then we would expect that things that it says, while they might not be a scientific treatise on something, would nonetheless be something consistent with science. And I've found this, very much so in so many different aspects of looking at the Bible. Matter of fact, as I've read through the Bible many times now, but as I look at the picture of what it describes, it fits so much of what I actually observe empirically around me in terms of behaviour of people, and also the whole concept of God, a creator God, a superintelligence that wants to have a relationship with us, actually makes a whole lot of sense to me. We have these programs where we're spending millions of dollars, probably hundreds of millions of dollars, on scientific programs trying to look for life in our outer space, looking for some sort of radiation, some sort of radio wave or microwave coming from outer space that seems to be encoded rather than just noise, and there's signs of some other sort of advanced civilization, or looking for signs of possible planets that could have life. And yet, when we look at life itself, and I've talked about this in many of the previous programs on the talks on this program, we know that it's absolutely impossible for life to have evolved and formed by chance. Just the complexity of the biochemistry of all the different types of life and all the different types of biochemistry and molecules and compounds that are in play in these biological systems. And it's so clear to me that there's evidence of a designer. Everything just works right. It's spot on from really just looking at the compounds that something like a little snail or an ant or an insect. When you look at the way they work and they operate and how they interact with their environment, get food and so forth, all their parts are just designed to work, properly there. And so it makes sense to me that if there was this amazing designer, and the Bible talks about how God made man in his image. Matter of fact, if we read in Genesis chapter 1, the first book of the Bible, and verse 26, then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. And then it goes on, let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over the cattle and over the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. And so God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them, and God blessed them. And so we can see now, if we're made in the image of God, and it's very interesting, we can understand about nature. We've been learning about DNA, the amazing code that programs the cells in all living things. We can see this incredible evidence for design. And to me, it just makes so much sense that there is a superior intelligence outside the space-time system that we understand as the universe, that wants to make contact with us. And of course the Bible explains that God made that contact down through the ages, through different people, but the time wasn't quite right. But during the time of the Roman Empire, when there was a lot of order, a lot of control, God came at that particular time, and that was as Jesus Christ, and lived. And when you look at the life of Jesus and the things that he did, and what he said was, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. The things that I'm doing are the sort of thing God does. It portrays this God of love, this God of care, and how we can have a relationship with him through prayer and also through providence. And we know, those of us that are Christians and have experienced God in our life, we know that it changes us, and it's very real. But when I think about how most people today, a large proportion of the world and growing proportion of the world live in cities, where we're very much isolated from the creation. We live in man-made buildings. We sit in offices surrounded by man-made machines, or maybe we're out working in man-made machines and so forth. So we're surrounded with a lot of things that we have made, as opposed to the things in nature that God has made. And it fascinates me that when we read in Genesis chapter 2, verse 7, for example, it said, "Then the Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and he became a living being. And the Lord God planted a garden in Eden in the east, and there he put man whom he had formed." So when God made man, he put us in a garden. Now, down a little bit further, it sort of repeats in verse 15 that says, "The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to till it and keep it." And as I've been, involved in gardening, I won't say that I'm a particularly good gardener, but I try and I read in this area, and I'm quite interested in gardening. One of the things that it's dawned on me recently is that as we work in the garden and you see the interaction and the spiders' webs and, all the different insects and this sort of thing, the evidence that there must be a creator is there. The complexity of the ecosystems that are there in the garden, and the beauty of the flowers and the different plants and leaves, the aesthetics of these, I appreciate them as beauty anyway, I think to me is all pointing that, yes, there is a creator. And it seems to me quite interesting that we've separated ourselves from that lifestyle in many ways in our modern living. And I was fascinated that fairly recently some articles have come out on the health benefits of gardening. And in 2017, in Preventative Medicine Reports, number 5, pages 292 to 99, there was a very interesting meta-analysis published, and the title was "Gardening is Beneficial for Health, a Meta-Analysis" by Masashi Soga and Kevin Gaston and Yuichi Yamura. And these scientists work at the Graduate School of Agriculture and Life Sciences at the University of Tokyo, and also at the University of Exeter in Cornwall. And so it's quite interesting. Just reading the abstract, it says there is increasing evidence that gardening provides substantial human health benefits. However, no formal statistical assessment has been conducted to test this assertion. Here we present the results of a meta-analysis of research examining the effects of gardening, including horticultural therapy, on health. We performed a literature search to collect the studies, and a participating gardeners and treatment groups. There were 22 case studies published after 2001, so they looked at studies essentially published this century. And there were 76 comparisons between controls and treatment groups. The studies came from the United States, Europe, Asia and the Middle East. And the studies reported a wide range of health outcomes, such as reductions in depression, reductions in anxiety, even reduction in body mass index, as well as increases in life satisfaction, quality of life, and also sense of community. So this study, they conclude that this study provided robust evidence for the positive effects of gardening on health. And then they said a regular dose of gardening can improve public health. And I thought this is really interesting that here we see in the Bible that God set man in a garden and he was to work it and to keep it. And as I thought about this and thinking about gardening and managing my own garden, you see the plants are continually growing and changing. So you've got to look after them. You've always got something to do. But at the same time, gardening offers the opportunity for a huge amount of creativity. You can, move, you might have some beautiful flowers and of different types, and so you can arrange them in a particular pattern. And you can make little sort of groves of colour and of different colours. So the opportunity to be highly creative in so many ways. And of course we know God is creative. God, created all the different forms of life. And then there's all the different types of animals that relate and interact with the garden. And I thought this is really interesting because here, a lot of people criticise Genesis in particular, but I think, here we have just one other little example that God put man in a garden. And it's interesting too that the original diet was plant-based food. So it says that originally God gave all the birds and the animals, they were to eat plants. And, of course, man was to eat the plants as well. And so the original diet, of course, was a plant-based diet. And when we think about today too, these are the things, plants are so easy to grow in the garden, and I guess that was part of the role was food. But of course, as we're learning now, as we understand about health, a lot of things about health, we know that the plant-based diet has a lot of advantages. And some of those advantages involve the importance of dietary fibre and our microbiome, or that is the amount of all the different types of actually bacteria that live in us and actually then help digest and take nutrients out of the food and make them available for our body to use. Of course, this is one of, the current areas of research there. And so as we read in verse 29 of Genesis 1, and God said to Adam, to the first couple there, "Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree with the seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food." And so, it's fascinating what we're finding out about the benefits of this food. Just recently too, one of my colleagues drew my attention to quite an interesting film called Kiss the Ground. And this film was about the urgent need that we have to conserve the topsoil on our planet. And we're losing topsoil at a huge rate. The desertification, the change of sort of grasslands and productive lands into desert is increasing. The areas of the Earth's surface that have become desert is certainly increasing at an alarming rate. And I remember reading a book that was published back in 1948. Was drawn to my attention in the early 70s. It was called Tree Crops, A Permanent Agriculture, by it's either John Russell Smith or Russell John Smith. He was a professor of geography, as I recall, at the University of Toronto. And back after the war, he wrote this book, and he pointed out that back then, in the United States alone, each year the amount of topsoil that they were losing as a result of poor farming, and that is over-tilling of the soil, would fill boxcars or freight cars that encircled the world, I think, many times with the soil that was just being lost from the United States alone. It's a very interesting book, Tree Crops, A Permanent Agriculture. And what he was advocating in that was the importance of growing trees for food, and getting our food from tree crops, because trees stabilise the soil. I think one of the examples I recall reading, and it is quite a while since I've read this book, was, for example, that if we were interested in growing sugar, we grow a lot of sugar cane, but if we grew honey locusts, we could actually produce more sugar per hectare than growing sugarcane. Of course, sugarcane can be fairly destructive of the soil unless the cane itself is ploughed back in rather than burnt off. And so, and a lot of nutrients were lost when they used to fire the cane. And so this film, Kiss the Ground, pointed out a very interesting fact that I wasn't aware of, that as the things like grass and plants grow, they put their roots down in the soil. And, of course, the animals like, sheep and cattle and so forth, bison, come along and eat the grass off the top. But the roots remain, and either the plant regrows or the roots die. Now, these roots are actually sequestering carbon. A lot of people are concerned about the amount of carbon that's increasing in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide as we burn fossil fuels. And this film pointed out that a huge amount of carbon is actually sequestered in the soil, in the roots of these plants. But when we plough and till and break up the soil, this breaks up these root structures, and a lot of it is lost, and the soil is then lost. But the other fascinating thing was that not only does this release then more carbon into the atmosphere, rather than taking the carbon out of the atmosphere, but they pointed out that this the amount of carbon in the soil stores water, and that soils that have a high carbon content can store much more water and therefore are less susceptible to drought and more productive. And it was very interesting. They showed some data where NASA, the American Space Agency, showed that, and they'd mapped out the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and showed that they increased very significantly at the time when traditional tilling of the soil was being done in the northern hemisphere, particularly across America, China and Europe, Asia and Europe. And that this tilling process, this heavily tilling and ploughing the soil and breaking it all up, and getting rid of all the plant matter, spraying the weeds and so forth. And, of course, a lot of the weeds send down very deep roots and bring up nutrients. That this they could show with their mapping, and I presume it was infrared mapping, that the carbon dioxide content of the atmosphere greatly increased at that time. Whereas during the planting time, when the crops were being planted and growing, the crops, of course, are taking the carbon dioxide in. The way I thought of it was, we know that plant fibre is so good for our health, and the point that struck me was it's clear that plant fibre is very important for the health of our soil, and of course, healthy soil is so important for health. Another paper that I came across just recently too was published in Clinical Medicine. This is the London published Clinical Medicine in 2018, and so it's in the June edition, issue number 3, pages 201 to 205. And the title of this article was Gardening for Health, a regular dose of gardening. And one of the abstracts, it says there's anxiety that the National Institute of Health cannot cope now and in the future with the health needs of an increasing age and population. And it's also realised that pharmaceutical drugs, as beneficial as they've been, are increasingly expensive and not always as effective as they appear. And drugs are also prescribed at the cost of side effects, which can be one of the leading causes of admissions to hospital, particularly for the elderly. And they go on and say that health depends on a range of social, economic and environmental factors. And what they go on to point out is that there's the opportunity to treat some physical and mental conditions with alternative or complementary therapies that encourage a change in lifestyle. And one of those things that they recommend is gardening. And they say, for example, that green care, or it says one group of holistic therapies that aim to treat the whole person and has been well researched through surveys and randomised trials, is so-called green care, or therapy by exposure to plants and gardening. And of course that's exactly where God originally intended man to be, in a garden, and to work in a garden. It goes on to point out, this article that was published in Clinical Medicine, several trials have revealed the beneficial effects on mood, mental health of simply observing nature or even images of natural scenes. In a Japanese study, viewing plants offered EEG recordings, that's sort of mapping the brain waves, and reduced stress, fear, anger and sadness, as well as reducing blood pressure, pulse rate and muscle tension. Another Japanese study simply found that it is more beneficial physiologically to view a green hedge rather than a concrete fence. So these are some really interesting studies that are coming out now on the benefits of gardening. So again, this review article published in Clinical Medicine 218, pages 201 to 205, by Richard Thompson, is extensively referenced to a lot of these studies if listeners want to follow up. In a pioneering randomised study by environmental psychologist Roger Ulrich, views of plants and trees from a post-operative wards improved the moods of patients and reduced analgesic use, that's painkiller use, surgical complications and length of stay. And similar beneficial results have been found for patients undergoing dental treatment. And so these are some fascinating things that are coming out. Therapeutic gardens have been used in hospitals actually for over 1,000 years, and they were strongly supported by Florence of Nightingale because they have beneficial effects on stress. And so it talks about a number of hospitals that have actually created gardens for the benefit of their patients. Gardening seems to be beneficial in health in many ways because it combines physical activity often with social interaction and also exposure to nature and sunlight. And this article points out that sunlight lowers blood pressure as well as increasing vitamin D levels, and that the fruit and vegetables that we can grow have a positive impact on the diet. And of course, that's very important too, because again, what do we read in the Bible? That God said in, again, Genesis chapter 1, verse 29, and God said, "Behold, I've given you every plant yielding seed which upon the face of the earth, and every tree with seed in fruit. You shall have these for food." And so these are the things that we can grow. These foods are so beneficial for us as we're learning more and more about them. And foods that are easy to grow, like legumes, the beans and peas that are relatively easy to grow. Very beneficial, excellent sources of protein and fibre, and plants like lettuce, and not to mention the more exciting perhaps plants to grow like the tomatoes and pumpkins, and of course there are so many exciting and different plants to grow too. There's the berries and the fruit trees. I think it's such an enjoyable thing. And the patients who were recovering from myocardial infarction or stroke find that exercise in the garden is more effective, enjoyable and sustainable than therapy in formal exercise settings. So there are so many benefits of being and having gardens and gardening, from the exercise point of view to it's good for your heart, good, reduces stress, can make you happy, improves your hand strength, can help the whole family get together, can even build your self-esteem, particularly if you have vegetables to share with friends and neighbours. And of course the thing is too, as we see, these mental effects can be so important. As I think about the Bible, I think the Bible is such an amazing book, and I would encourage every listener to, if you haven't got a Bible, to get a Bible and begin reading it, and believe that God really exists. And I think that you will find that God will begin to speak to you from the words of this book, because the book was inspired by God. And we're now seeing so much scientific evidence supporting even the fine details in this book. You've been listening to Faith and Science. And remember, if you'd like to re-listen to this program, or on earlier programs, just Google 3ABN Australia, or one word, .org.au. And click on the listen button, and there are a number of previous programs there that you can listen to. My other programs, Science Conversations, are also available online. And of course, on the website, you can go to the television section and view the television section program Evolution Impossible series. I'm Dr. John Ashton. Have a great day.
You've been listening to a production of 3ABN Australia Radio.